The Afghan Deputy Prime Minister had just visited Mazar to pray at the shrine of Hazarati Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. But in Afghanistan, as in most rural countries, religion was regarded with deepest respect in the villages rather than in the towns, and it was from the villages that the Mujahideen came. Although it was a reactionary force, opposing the emancipation and equality of women and secular education, it focused the attention of the poor on the realities of politics in a way that had never happened before. It was not by chance that a joke made the rounds of Afghans in Kabul that apart from the 5 traditional obligations of Islam, a 6th instruction must now be obeyed. Every true Muslim should listen to the BBC. This would no longer be a joke, of course, if a new Islamic force emerged from within the resistance rather than the clergy. So few journalists were now left in Afghanistan that no one paid much attention to the Times correspondent, who carried no cameras but still possessed a valid visa. In Kabul, I shopped for carpets in the bazaar among the off-duty Soviet soldiers who still felt safe walking along Chicken Street. The Russians bought souvenirs, beads, and necklaces for wives and girlfriends, but the Tajik Soviet soldiers would go to the bookshops and buy copies of the Quran. I eventually purchased a 2x3-meter rug of crimson and gold that had been lying on the damp pavement. Mr. Samadali, who was still free to drive us within the Kabul city limits, cast his critical eye on my rug, announced that I had paid far too much for it. It is a function of all taxi drivers in Southwest Asia to depress their foreign clients by assuring them they have been ripped off, and tied it to the roof of his car. From Kabul, I now once more took Ali's bus down to Jalalabad, planning to spend a night at the Spingarh before returning to Kabul. In the Jalalabad bazaar, I was searching for a satin bag in which to carry my massive carpet out of Afghanistan. After ensuring I knew the Pushtu for a satin bag at Lasi Kazora, I bought a large Hessian sack, along with a set of postcards of Jalalabad under the monarchy, a gentle, soporific town of technicolor brilliance that was now lost forever. I visited the Pakistani consulate in the town, whose staff, some of them at least, must already have been coordinating with the guerrillas. They spoke of Soviet fears that Jalalabad might partially fall to the rebels, that the highway to Kabul might be permanently cut, and the Pakistani diplomats did not seem at all unhappy at this prospect. No sooner was I back at the Spingarh than the receptionist, in a state of considerable emotion, told me that the Russians were using helicopters to attack the village of Sork Rud, 20 kilometers to the west. I hired a rickshaw, and within half an hour found myself in a township of dirt streets and mud-walled houses. I told the driver to wait on the main road and walked into the village. There was not a human to be seen, just the distant thump-thump sound of Soviet Mi-25 helicopters, which I only occasionally saw as they flitted past the ends of the street. A few dogs yelped near a stream of sewage. The sun was high, and a blanket of heat moved on the breeze down the streets. So where was the attack that had so upset the hotel receptionist? I only just noticed the insect shape of a machine low in the white sky seconds before it fired. There was a sound like 100 golf balls being hit by a club at the same time, and bullets began to skitter up the walls of the houses, little puffs of brown clay jumping into the air as the rounds hit the buildings. One line of bullets came skipping down the street in my direction, and in panic I ran through an open door, across a large earthen courtyard, and into the first house I could see. I literally hurled myself through the entrance and landed on my side on an old carpet. Against the darkened wall opposite me sat an Afghan man with a graying beard and a clutch of children, open-mouthed with fear, and, behind him, holding a blank sheet over her head, a woman. I stared at him and tried to smile. They sat there in silence. I realized I had to assure them that I was not a Russian, that I was from Mrs. Thatcher's England, that I was a journalist. But would this family understand what England was, or what a journalist was? I was out of breath, frightened, wondering how I came to be in such a dangerous place, so quickly, so thoughtlessly, so short a time after leaving the safety of the Spingarh Hotel. I had enough wits to remember the Pushtu for a journalist and to try to tell these poor people who I was. Sorry if I messed this up. Zad di Inglisi Atlasi Kazora Yem, I triumphantly announced, but the family stared at me with even greater concern. The man held his children closer to him, and his wife made a whimpering sound. I smiled. They did not. Fear crackled over the family. Only slowly did I realize that I had not told them I was a journalist. Perhaps it was the carpet upon which I had landed in their home. Certainly it must have been by my visit to the bazaar a few hours earlier, but with increasing horror, I realized that the disheveled correspondent who had burst in upon their sacred home had introduced himself in Pushtu, not as a reporter, but with the imperishable statement, "I am an English satin bag." Correspondent, journalist, I now repeated in English and Pushtu. But the damage had been done. Not only was this Englishman dangerous, alien, an infidel intruder into the sanctity of an Afghan home, he was also insane. Of this I had no doubt myself. Whenever we journalists find ourselves in great danger, there is always a voice that asks, why? How on earth did we ever come to risk our life in this way? For the editor? For adventure? Or because we just didn't calculate the risks, didn't bother to reflect that our whole life, our education, our family, our loves and happiness were now forfeit to chance and a few paragraphs. Sork Rood was the border station into which Kipling's British soldier cantered the street outside this house, his dark defile. The helicopter his enemy's Jazeo. The cliché tells us that life is cheap. Untrue. Death is cheap. It is easy and terrible and utterly unfair. I sat on the carpet for perhaps 10 minutes, smiling idiotically at the cold-faced family opposite me, until a little girl in a pink dress walked unsteadily across the floor towards me and smiled. I smiled back. I pointed at myself and said, "Robert." She repeated my name. I pointed to her. What was her name? She didn't reply. Outside, I heard a donkey clop past the gate and a man shouting. The sound of the helicopters had vanished. There was a wailing from far away, the sound of a woman in grief. I stood up and looked out of the door. Other people were walking down the street. It was like Jalalabad each daybreak, when the night of death turned magically into a day of toil and dust and blooming jacaranda trees. The war had washed over Sork Rood, and now it had moved elsewhere. I turned to the family and thanked them for their unoffered protection. "Shukriya," I said. "Thank you." And very slowly the man with the beard bowed his head once and raised his right hand in farewell. The rickshaw driver was waiting on the main road. Fearful that I might have died, even more fearful, I thought, that I might not have survived to pay him. We puttered back to Jalalabad. That night the party leaders were back in the hotel, with news that obviously disturbed them. The Mujahideen had raided a student hostel of Jalalabad University, taken 20 girls from the building, and transported them to Tora Bora, where they were given money, 1,000 Afghanis, about $22, and a black veil, and told to end their studies. The same day, a Russian technical engineer had been sent to the suburbs of Jalalabad to mend an electric cable that had been repeatedly sabotaged. When he was at the top of a pylon, someone had shot him dead, and his body hung on the wires 10 meters above the ground for several hours, while men and women arrived to gaze at his corpse. I would leave next day on the first bus back to Kabul, a luxury bus that left at dawn. Long before Ali's old vehicle ground into town, my visa had only another 3 days to run. The bus from Jalalabad was packed, not with the villagers and Pakistani businessmen who traveled on Ali's charabanc, but with Afghan government students, Parachem party apparatchiks. That is a word I don't know. Apparatchiks. a member of a communist apparat, a unquestioningly loyal subordinate, especially of a political leader or organization, a communist who has a member of the administrative system of who was a member of the administrative system of a communist party. Parcham Party apparatchiks traveling back to Kabul University after vacation. Even before we had left the suburbs of the city, they were ordering everyone to pull the curtains so that no one could be seen, and they craned their necks at every bend in the road to squint through the cracks in case an ambush lay ahead. I didn't see how the curtains would help. A mystery bus would attract far more attention from the Mujahideen than a vehicle with windows open and passengers asleep inside. When we stopped 25 kilometers to the north to find the body of a dead man covered in a blanket being loaded onto a truck, the communist students gazed in silence and in horror. It was, according to a middle-aged Afghan on another bus, the corpse of a lorry driver who had not stopped for the Mujahideen. There were 5 buses bunched up together, all heading for Kabul, and they all stopped now at a Chaikhana. While their drivers debated whether to talk their way through the guerrilla roadblock up the road or turn back to Jalalabad. 2 hours passed, the drivers unable to make up their minds, the young Afghan men ever more nervous, and with good reason. The Mujahideen gave their prisoners only 2 options. They could join the resistance or face execution. Some of the Afghan boys were taking off their party badges. I could only feel sorry for them. Perhaps they joined Parcham for promotion at college or because their parents worked for the government. And for all the government's brutality and its reliance on foreign invaders, its functionaries had been trying to create a secular, equal society in the villages around Jalalabad. It was not the government that was burning the schools and killing the teachers. Another hour drifted by, the heat rising, the students ever more depressed, the drivers basking in the sun. In wartime, in any great danger, indecision is a narcotic. Then, laboring up the highway, came Ali's wooden bus, the coat of arms of the Northwest Frontier Province proudly displayed on its flanks. "Why do you desert me?" Ali wanted to know. He pointed to his cherubim. "Mr. Robert, please, come with us." So I took my usual seat on the right-hand side of his vehicle, and the other buses moved out into the road like sheep behind us. "You are better with us, Mr. Robert," Ali said. "You should not be with them." I soon realized why. Round a bend, just 5 kilometers up the highway, in a narrow valley of rocks and small pines, 6 tall and sunburned Mujahideen stood astride the road. A 7th was perched on a rock, lazily waving his arm up and down to tell us to stop. We have been told that they were poorly armed, that they only dared appear at dusk, that they were frightened of government retaliation. But here were the Mujahideen, in the hot midday sun, in their turbans and Afghan shawls, each holding a brand new Kalashnikov, controlling the traffic on one of Afghanistan's most important highways. It was an audacious display of self-confidence, and a fearful one for the students in the bus behind. There was no anxiety in Ali's bus, and a Pakistani passenger, a cloth merchant from Peshawar, was so bored that he began a long and tiresome discussion about Pakistan's domestic politics. Through the back window, however, I could see the students stepping off their bus onto the road. They stood there, heads lowered as if they were criminals, some trying to hide behind the others. Ali was chatting and joking with one of the guerrillas. The other drivers stood beside their buses expressionless. The gunmen were moving through the line of young Afghans. Some were ordered back on the bus. Others, white with fear, were told to form a line by the road. 3 of them were tied up and blindfolded and taken, stumbling and falling, through the pine stands and towards the river that gurgled away to our right. We watched them until they and their captors had disappeared. The Pakistani cloth merchant clucked his tongue and shook his head. "Poor chaps," he said. Ali climbed back aboard and announced that since this was a Pakistani bus, the Mujahideen did not wish to trouble us. And as we drove away, a young guerrilla with a rose tied to his rifle waved vigorously at us through the window. At last I had seen them. They were the holy warriors, whom the CIA was now adopting, the terrorists and bandits, and counter-revolutionary subversive elements, as Karmal called them, the remnants, as the Soviet general blandly dismissed them, Mr. Ziaurad's students of imperialism. But they didn't look like remnants to me. Their Kalashnikovs were the new AKS-74s that the Soviets had just brought into Afghanistan, and they were wearing new ammunition belts. The Kabul Intercontinental was forlorn. Most Western journalists had been expelled or left. Gavin and his crew had gone. My visa would soon expire, and there was no hope of acquiring another. In the hotel sales office, one of the female secretaries, Gina Nushin, pleaded with me to take her private mail out of the country. 9 months later, in Ireland, I would receive a cryptic note from her, thanking me for posting her letters. The stamp on the envelope depicted a smiling and avuncular President Taraki, browsing through his morning papers. But a far more important letter had just reached Kabul, smuggled out of the Soviet Union by a Shia cleric who had been arrested after Taraki's 1978 revolution, and who was believed to have been murdered by the Afghan secret police. The mullah, whose name was Waez, and who had enlisted the help of a sympathetic Soviet worker and an Afghan student at Moscow University to take his letter by hand to Kabul, told his family that he and hundreds of other Afghans were being held prisoner in the Russian city of Tula, 200 kilometers south of Moscow. Waez was honored among Sunnis as well as Shias for his opposition to communist rule. Rumors that thousands of Afghans were being secretly held in the Soviet Union in violation of international law had been circulating for more than a year. Many of the families whom I watched as they angrily stormed the Policharki prison outside Kabul in January were looking for relatives who, it now appeared, might have been in Russia all along. According to the Waez letter, he and other Afghans jailed in Tula were referred to as state prisoners, although all were seized in Afghanistan. In 1979, the U.S. ambassador to Kabul, Adolf Dubs, had been murdered by gunmen who, intriguingly, had initially demanded Waez's release in return for the diplomat's life. Were the Soviets unwilling to free Waez because this would reveal how many Afghans were held captive in Tula? I knew that Afghanistan's government was forcing the last of us out of the country, but the door was still ajar, and I thought there was a crack through which I might squeeze. The asterisk next to that goes to, it was instructive to note that Soviet journalists had so much difficulty in conveying the reality of this early stage of the war that Moscow newspapers were reduced to printing extracts from Western dispatches, including my own. To continue, I made one last trip to Jalalabad with Ali, only to find my hotel the venue for a clandestine meeting between 6 senior Soviet officers and the Afghan Interior Minister Syed Mohammad Gulabzoy? Sorry for mispronouncing. And his local officials, all anxious to prevent a full-scale siege of Jalalabad by the rebels. So dangerous was the highway that the Russians had to be flown down from Kabul by helicopter. I watched them arrive at the Spinghar, protected by security police and riot visors who erected belt-fed machine guns on tripods upon bar tables around the hotel's rose gardens. There were now 3,000 Soviet troops outside the town, and the destruction of the villages around Jalalabad was now underway. Alsing and Alinghar, outside Metarlam, had been bombed by the Russians, but a 40-kilometer journey into Mujahideen-held territory in Laghman province showed that every school and government office in the village had been burned by the rebels. Several villagers said that up to 50 women and children had been killed in Soviet air raids in the previous 3 days. An old man with an unshaven face kept repeating the word napalm, gesturing with his hands in a downward smothering motion. In one tiny village outside Metarlam, more than 200 men surrounded my taxi when they thought we were Russians. The Mujahideen were not without their humor. 2 nights earlier, an Afghan truck driver found a notice on the main road west. "In the name of God," it read, "this is for tanks." The driver journeyed on and promptly set off a landmine. An armed insurgent then turned up to demand that the lorry driver pay $350 for the explosives which he had just wasted. Far less amusing was a report from 3 independent sources in Jalalabad that a museum at Hadda containing a statue of Buddha dating from at least the 2nd century BC had been destroyed, along with other priceless antiquities. What did this mean? And if the reports were true, what confidence could the world have that the giant 1400-year-old Buddhas of Bamiyan might not one day be similarly destroyed? On my way back to Kabul, the guerrillas were back on the road, 20 of them this time, and there were no longer any roses attached to their rifles. I would briefly return to Afghanistan. In the summer of 1980, flying into Kabul with a tennis racket and an unbelievable claim to be a tourist. The Qad attached a cop to me this time, and I was taken under escort to the Intercontinental, where I paid him off in return for a taxi ride around the capital. The dust hung in layers of heat over Kabul, and the Soviet soldiers were now on the defensive, escorting civilian cars in long armored convoys across the highways of Afghanistan, their air base at Bagram, now flying bombing sorties against the Mujahideen every 3 minutes. Soviets now occupied senior advisory positions in all the Kabul ministries, their large black limousines gliding through the muggy streets of the city at midday, curtains pulled across the back windows, and plain-clothes men peering from the front passenger seats. The occupants were not the large, bulky commissars of popular mythology, but, for the most part, small, respectable men in glossy gray business suits, narrow, slightly unfashionable ties, and hair thick with oil. Family men from an autonomous republic with 5-year plans to meet. In the stifling summer, the Russian soldiers were wearing floppy, wide-brimmed sombreros, and their trucks jammed the streets of Kabul. Their limited intervention had spawned a spring offensive, that tactic beloved of all generals, confronted by an armed insurrection, which had now turned into a full-scale military campaign. Helicopter gunships stood in rows 5 deep at the Kabul airport. 4-engined Ilyushin transport aircraft en route to Tashkent turned all day over to the city, trailing fuel exhaust as they banked sharply above the international airport to avoid ground-to-air missiles. At the airport, the 2 faces of Afghanistan's revolution could be seen within 800 meters of each other. Above the main terminal building, the faded outline of January's triumphant greeting to Soviet troops could still be observed. Quote, "Welcome to the new model revolution," end quote. Although the 1.5-meter-high letters had long ago been taken down and the sun had bleached the red paint a drab pink, just across the airfield at the eastern end of the main runway lay the other symbol of Afghanistan's revolutionary conflict, a Soviet SA-2 missile with a 130-kilogram warhead, a range of 50 kilometers, and a maximum altitude of 50,000 feet. This was the same weapon used with devastating effect against U.S. B-52 bombers over Hanoi in the Vietnam War. And Vietnam was the word that more and more Afghans were using to describe their own conflict. President Carter and Mrs. Thatcher were urging the world to boycott the Olympics in Moscow. Kabul's school children were refusing to attend classes, since hundreds of them were taken ill. Rebels, according to the government, had put sulfur in the school's water supplies. 1,000 children had been taken to the Aliabad hospital in 1 week alone. At night, gun battles crackled around the city as gunmen attacked Russian patrols, and rival Parcham and Khalq party members assaulted each other. A doctor who was a member of President Karmal's Parcham party was shot dead while visiting a patient at Bandagazi, within the city limits, but the police could not discover whether he was killed by Mujahideen or by Khalq agents. One of the cops assigned to me was a Khalq man who, in the privacy of the hotel elevator, suddenly burst out in anger. Quote, "It is bad here, and I am sick. We want Soviet help. We need it. But if anyone stays longer than we want, anyone, and that includes the Soviet Union, we will shoot them." End quote. On the 14th of June, Karmal ordered the execution of 13 former Khalq functionaries for hatching conspiracies against the state. Most were minor officials. Sirak Alamyar, the ex-planning minister, for example, and Sahib John Sarai, who was in charge of border affairs, while the deputy prime minister, Azadullah Sarwari, who was head of Taraki's secret service, remained untouched. His name was on the death list of the night letter pushed into diplomatic compounds 4 months earlier. I was lucky to have stolen 48 hours in Kabul, albeit under secret police surveillance. When I was taken back to the Kabul airport for my flight out, an Aeroflot jet was standing on the apron, its fuselage evidence for Mrs. Thatcher's profound cynicism towards the Soviets. The aircraft bore Aeroflot's proud English-language slogan, "Official Olympic Carrier." On both sides of its fuselage, but from its doors, it was disgorging Soviet combat troops, young men, some with blonde hair, carrying their rifles in the hot sun as they walked down the steps to the tarmac. They looked happy enough. One raised his arms towards the sun and said something that made his comrades laugh. Although their chances of returning home in similar mood had decreased in recent weeks, more than 600 seriously wounded Soviet servicemen had been admitted to the Kabul military hospital, another 400 to Soviet clinics near the bus station at Khair Khana. Of these 1,000, 200 had died, and this figure only included those who died of wounds, not those who were killed in combat. The dead were loaded in square wooden coffins aboard Antonov 12 aircraft, and no one knew what they contained until a young Soviet soldier who was seen saluting one of the boxes. Even the cod secret policeman who followed me so assiduously agreed that the Soviet army was experiencing very big trouble. But back in that chill February of 1980, I still had 2 days of precious, lonely freedom before my visa expired, and I was forced to leave Afghanistan. I decided this time to be greedy, to try once more a long-distance bus ride, this time to a city whose people, so we were told in Kabul, had rediscovered their collective faith in confronting the invaders of their country, Kandahar. I took the bus before dawn, the same station I had set out from my vain trip to Mazar, wearing the same Afghan hat and hunched under the same brown shawl. Men and women sat together. They all appeared to be families, and the moment I announced my nationality, I was deluged with apples, cheeses, oranges, and the big, flat, sagging naan bread that Afghans use as an envelope to contain their food. When I gently expressed my concern that there might be bad people on the bus, the very word "cod" usually had the effect of silencing any conversation for an hour. I was assured there were none. I would be safe. And so the passengers, with scarcely any English, gave me their silent protection on the 14-hour journey across the moon-like, frozen landscape to Kandahar. It was an epic of a country at war. Our coach passed the wrecks of countless vehicles beside the road. 65 kilometers west of Ghazni, the town from which Gavin and I and his crew had fled the previous month, it already felt another life ago. A convoy of civilian buses and trucks had just been ambushed. All of the vehicles were burning fiercely, sending columns of black smoke funneling up from the snow-covered plains. Small, darkened mounds lay beside the buses, all that was left of some of their passengers. Soviet convoys passed us in the opposite direction, each vehicle carrying a Russian soldier standing in the back, pistol in hand. The Soviets were now too busy ensuring their own safety to worry about the civilians they had supposedly come to rescue from the bandits. In one village, 3 Afghan soldiers, including an officer, boarded our bus and tried to arrest a postman who had deserted from the army. There was a brutal fistfight between soldiers and passengers until 2 uniformed conscripts who were smoking hashish in the back seats walked down the aisle and literally kicked the officer out of the vehicle. So much for the morale of Karmal's Afghan army. In another village, the passengers hissed at Soviet Tajik troops who were standing beside the barbed wire of a military depot. But the passenger behind tapped me urgently on the soldier. "Look," he gasped. He pointed to his forehead. I looked at his face and could not understand. "Look," he said more urgently, and placed his right hand flat on top of his head, as if it were a hat. Hat. Yes, there was something missing from the Soviet Tajik soldiers' gray fur hats. They had removed the red star from their hats. They stood looking at us, darker skinned than their Russian comrades, bereft now of the communist brotherhood in which they had grown up. I should have understood at once. If Soviet troops in Afghanistan, Muslim Soviet soldiers, would remove the very symbol of their country, the badge that their fathers had worn so proudly in the great patriotic war between 1941 and 1945, then already the cancer of Afghanistan must have eaten deep into their souls. They had been sent to war against their Muslim co-religionists, and had decided that they would not fight them. No more telling portent of the imminent collapse of empire would have confronted me in Afghanistan. Yet my trek across the snowlands was so vast, the dangers so great, my exhaustion so overwhelming, that I merely jotted in my notebook the observation that the soldiers had, quote, for some reason, quote, unquote, removed their hat badges. A few miles further on, an Afghan soldier could be seen standing in the desert, firing into the dusk with a submachine gun at an enemy he could not possibly have seen. When our bus stopped at a chaikhana in the frozen semi-darkness, an old man from the burned convoy we had passed told us that of the 300 passengers taken from the buses, 50 were detained by more than 100 armed rebels, all of them told, quite openly, that they would probably be executed because they were party men. Each scene spoke for itself, a cameo of violence and government impotence that our frightened passengers clearly understood. It was night when we entered Kandahar, the ancient capital of Afghanistan, our bus gliding past the shrine in which lay the cloak of the Prophet Muhammad, circling a set of 19th century cannon that had belonged to General Roberts's army in the Second Afghan War. I was dirty and tired and checked into a seedy hotel in the old city, a place of cigarette smoke, sweat, and overcooked meat. My bedroom was small, the sheets stained, the threadbare carpet smallpoxed with cigarette burns, but 2 big rust-encrusted doors led onto a tiny balcony from where I could see the moon and the stars which glistened across the winter sky. I was lying on my bed when I first heard the sound, Allahu Akbar, God is great. It was a thin, pitched wail, Allahu Akbar, God is great. I looked at my watch. This was no fixed time for prayers. It was 9 o'clock. The curfew had just begun. Allahu Akbar. Now the chant came from the next roof, scarcely 20 meters from my room, more a yodel than an appeal to the Almighty. I opened the door to the balcony. The cry was being carried on the air, a dozen, 100 Allahu Akbars, uncoordinated, overlaying each other, building upon a foundation of identical words, high-pitched and tenor, treble and childlike, an army of voices shouting from the rooftops of Kandahar. They swelled in volume, 1,000 now, 10,000, a choir that filled the heavens, that floated beneath the white moon and the stars, the music of the spheres. I saw a family, a husband and wife, and a clutch of children, all chanting, but their voices were lost in the pulse of sound that now covered the city. This extraordinary phenomenon was no mere protest, a lament at the loss of freedom. When the Prophet entered Mecca in the year 630 of the Christian era, He walked to the great black stone, the Kaaba, touched it with his stick, and shouted in a strong voice that supreme invocation of Islam, Allahu Akbar. His 10,000 followers chorused those same words, and they were taken up by members of the Prophet's own Qurayshi tribe, who had gathered on their roofs and balconies in Mecca. Now these same holy words were being chanted by another 10,000 voices, this time from the roofs and balconies of Kandahar. A Westerner, or a Russian, might interpret this as a semi-political demonstration, a symbolic event, but in reality, the choirs of Kandahar were an irresistible assertion of religious faith, the direct and deliberate repetition of one of the holiest moments of Islam. In the last year of his life, the Prophet had entered the newly purified shrine in Mecca, and 7 more times chanted Allahu Akbar. In Kandahar, the voices were desperate, but all-powerful, mesmeric, unending, deafening, and otherwise silent people, recognizing their unity in God. This was an unstoppable force, an assertion of religious identity that no Afghan satrap or Kremlin army could ultimately suppress. Kandahar's earthly political protests had little effect. Shopkeepers had closed down the bazaar for more than 2 weeks, but a squad of Afghan soldiers forced its reopening by threatening to smash stores whose owners did not obey their orders. Afghan troops could be found chain-smoking in their trucks beside the Kalki Sharif Mosque, but the 5 rebel groups operating south of Kandahar had united, and the otherwise obedient mullahs had told the city's Muslim population that they should be aware of events, an over-discreet but nonetheless unprecedented reference to the Soviet invasion. And over the past few days, a series of poorly printed posters had made their appearance on the walls of the reopened bazaar. "The people are asleep," one of them admonished. "Why do you not wake up?" Another, addressed to Soviet troops, asked simply, "Sons of Lenin, what are you doing here?" Yet the poster addressed to the Russians was written in Pushtu, a language with which Soviet troops were unlikely to be familiar. And 5 days earlier, the people of Kandahar had watched from those same balconies and rooftops as a column of tanks, tracked armored vehicles, and trucks drove through their city. The first tanks were seen just after 9 in the evening, and the tail of the convoy only left Kandahar at 4 in the morning. Most of the Soviet convoy ended up along the road to Spin Boldak on the Pakistan border. In Kandahar, food prices had doubled. Inflation had cut into wages. Meat and rice prices in the city had risen by 80%, and eggs 100%. A shopkeeper, an educated man in his 50s, who combined a European sweater and jacket with traditional Afghan baggy trousers and turban, claimed that Karmal's government could not survive if it was unable to control food prices. "Every day the government says that food prices are coming down," he said. "Every day we are told things are getting better, thanks to the cooperation of the Soviet Union. But it is not true." The man lapsed into obscenities. "Do you realize that the government cannot even control the roads? Fuck them. They only hold on to the cities." This I already knew, and the journey back to Kabul, 450 kilometers across the lagoons of snow and deserts held by marauding rebels, was evidence of the terrible future that Afghanistan would be forced to endure. From the windows of my bus, I saw 8 kilometers from the road an entire village on fire, the flames golden against the mountain snows, while the highway was sometimes in the hands of gunmen. Several, I noticed, were wearing Arab kufiya scarves, or truckloads of cringing Afghan soldiers. The Russian troops were moving up the side roads now, spreading their army across the plains, driving imperiously into the smallest villages. At one intersection, a Soviet patrol was parked, the soldiers in their BMB armored vehicles watching us with routine disinterest, already counting their mission as something normal. This was now their land, their inheritance, dangerous to be true, but a part of their life, a duty to be done. But their mission was as hopeless as it was illusory. Even if they kill 1 million of us, an Afghan Bazari, was to say to me later in Kabul, "There are 1,000,000 more of us ready to die. We never allow people to stay in our country." Both statements were true. Only days after I left Kabul, Afghan troops and security men brutally suppressed a mass demonstration against the Soviet invasion, shooting down hundreds of protesters, including women students, in the streets of the capital. Well over 1,000,000 Afghans would be killed in the war against the Russians over the next 9 years. At least 4 million would be wounded, and 6 million driven out of the country as refugees, even before the Afghan war entered its further tragedy of civil conflict between the Mujahideen, Taliban rule, and subsequent American bombardment. What that suffering meant, we would only discover later. The most efficient killers were the armies of landmines sown across the mountains and fields of Afghanistan by the Soviets. The war would cost the Russians, it has been estimated, around $35 billion. $2.5 billion worth of Russian aircraft were lost in 1 year alone, and the Americans claim to have spent $10 billion on the conflict. Saudi Arabia, on its own admission, in 1986, spent $525 million in just 2 years on Afghan opposition parties and their Arab supporters. Pakistani sources would later say that 3,000 to 4,000 Arab fighters were in action in Afghanistan at any one time throughout the war, and that as many as 25,000 Arabs saw service in the fighting. Yet in the end, once the Russian bear had burned its paws and the Soviet Union was on its way to perdition, the Americans and their Arab and Pakistani suppliers abandoned Afghanistan to its fate and ignored the thousands of Arabs who had fought there. Nor did any Saudi prince risk his life for the Afghans, nor any Arab leader ever dare to go to war for his fellow Muslim there, nor did Yasser Arafat, who understood the meaning of dispossession, ever criticize the army of occupation that was to lay waste the Muslim lands between the Amu Darya and the Duran line. Only bin Laden and his men represented the Arabs. I flew out of Kabul on a little Pakistani prop aircraft that bucked in the air pockets over the Hindu Kush and dropped me into the basking, bakery-hot airport at Peshawar, from which Francis Gary Powers had set off 20 years earlier in his doomed U-2 intelligence plane over the Soviet Union. I was lightheaded, overwhelmed to have watched history and survived, possessed of a schoolboy immaturity. Hitchcock's foreign correspondent had nothing on this asterisk. And the asterisk goes to, but at least Hitchcock's Huntley Haverstock would go on seeing the war with his own eyes. Charles Douglas Home would later express to me every editor's fear for a story uncovered. Quote, "Now that we have no regular coverage from Afghanistan," he wrote, "I would be grateful if you could make certain that we do not miss any opportunity for reporting on reliable accounts of what is going on in that country. We must not let events in Afghanistan vanish from the papers simply because we have no correspondent there." End quote. And back where we were. At my hotel, a message from Ivan Barnes told me I had won an award for my reporting on the Iranian Revolution. "Have a very big drink on me tonight," he telexed. The editor announced a $1,000 bonus. A letter was to arrive with congratulations from my old soldier father. "Well done, fella," he wrote. I could not sleep. Next morning, I indulged my innocence by riding the old British steam train back up the Khyber Pass to take one last look at Afghanistan before I returned to Beirut. Engine driver Mohammed Salim Khan, a brisk and mustachioed Pathan with a topi on his head and 18 years' experience with Pakistan Railways under his arm, wiped his oilcloth over the firebox of his 60-year-old steam engine, knowingly tapped the lubricator, a Wakefield patent made in London EC4, and eased loco number 2511 out of Peshawar's hot and smoky station. Every schoolboy would have loved SGS class number 2511, and so did I. She had 6 driving wheels, a smokestack with a lid like a teapot, a rusting boiler under constant repair, a squadron of gaskets that leaked steam, and a footplate that reeked of oil, smoke, and freshly brewed tea. She made a noise like thunder, and I clung like a child to the fittings of Mr. Khan's footplate. The Ministry of Defense in Islamabad paid for the upkeep of the 60 kilometers of track. They might need it one day to take their own army up to Landi Kotal if those Russian convoys spilled over the border. But its subsidy allowed us to hammer our way up the 1 in 3 gradient, the steepest in the world, black smoke boxing us into the more than 30 tunnels that lined the route, a thin, shrieking whistle sending buffaloes, goats, sheep, children, and old men off the track. At 3,000 feet, number 2511 performed so sharp a turn above so sheer a ridge of boulders high above a spinning river that Mr. Khan and I grasped the iron doors of the cab to stop ourselves falling out. So we steamed into Landi Kotal from Jamrud Fort, our loco fuming in the sharp, high-altitude breeze. And when I jumped down from the footplate and crunched my way across the gravel of the permanent way, there were the pale blue mountains of Afghanistan, shimmering to the north and west, sun-soaked and cold and angry and familiar and dangerous. I looked at them with attachment now, as one always does a dark land from which one has emerged alive. Up there, with Gavin and his crew, I had reached the top of the world. Never could I have imagined what we had given birth to in Afghanistan, nor what it held in store for that same world in 21 years' time, nor the pain it was to hold for me. And that's the end of chapter 3. Thank you for listening.